So today we're presenting the findings of our in-depth psychological interviews. And since I think it was beginning in November or December, I started doing interviews with white supremacists and one person that was also in QAnon. And the interviews tend to be about 2 hours long, and they were all provided to us mainly through TM Garrett and Jeff Shoup. So we're really, really grateful for that, for their help in even making this research possible. And the research looked at uh, why white supremacists, what their vulnerabilities and motivations for joining were, the groups that recruited them, how they were influenced to join, as well as their positive and negative experiences in the group. I always like to focus on the positive as well as the negative, because we need to understand, what are people getting out of this? You know, why would they want to join and why would they stay in? Looking at their indoctrination, and in some cases, in many cases, the push to violence, and their eventual disillusionment and exiting for those who exited the groups. So, and then Molly Ellenberg, who's our research fellow and is our quantitative person, has coded all of the data on 261 variables that we agreed on, and carefully analyzed every single one of the interviews, and then analyzed those variables as a whole. And you'll see that in our report, which we'll be discussing shortly. In regard to discussion and live chat, since we're a small group, we can really just talk. Well, I mean, you can chat as much as you want, but we'll have the opportunity to really have an intimate discussion, since this is a smaller group today, which will be really nice, I think. But I always give this warning because we did have someone insulting someone else's religion. So if you insult race, religion, in any way insult other people, we do eject you, and we have learned how to do that. And so that's my warning to people that insult in chat. And we do capture all the chat, and we'll send it out to everybody afterwards, and we are video recording. And I always like to thank our sponsors, past and present. So ICSVE was started in part with State Department money. We are currently funded by the European Union. We've been funded by UN Women. We put out a manual for UN Women on PCVE, which we're very proud of. Facebook provides funding to us. We have private donors, and we're funded by the state of Qatar. And we're really thankful to the state of Qatar to make possible our Breaking the ISIS Brand Counter-Narratives project, which now has 263 in-depth interviews of ISIS defectors, returnees, and prisoners, and over 250 video clips of terrorist defectors. But we've been mirroring that effort now with the far right. So all of these interviews, we video record them, and if the person agrees, and we discuss it in depth with them at the end of the interview, if they agree, we cut a short video clip from the larger interview. So usually our video clips follow a format of why they wanted to go into the group, what they got out of it, and what it really was, how it didn't fit their expectations or didn't truly meet their needs, how they got disillusioned, and then warnings, if they have been willing to give them, to others not to join and why they shouldn't join. And then we campaign with those. That's where Facebook comes in as far as being a sponsor to our research. We campaign with those videos. In the case of ISIS, we subtitle them in 27 different languages and campaign around the world. We usually have campaigns going in Europe, in the Middle East and North Africa region, in different parts of the world. And again, Molly's in charge of running those campaigns, and she also does all the data analysis from the campaigns. And it's quite interesting studying how they work. But now with the white supremacism, we are doing the same, and we call it escape hate. And we're just starting that. Molly, is that starting this week or next week? I can't remember.
It will depend on some logistics, but it'll start this week or next week.
Okay, yeah, and I think, Jeff, your video is the first one that's going out. Oh no, whose is the first? Brian? Oh, okay, but you're queued up there. you're in the beginnings. And we made, with everybody that we've made a video of that agreed, we made a 5-minute video, and then we made a 1-minute video. And I know, Jeff, we've talked about always sending you when they're up. You just got to get Acacia to look at the YouTube and grab them for the website, because I forget to send them to you because there's too much. But anyway, so let's go to our PowerPoint so that we can talk about the findings. And so anyway, I've already told you a bit about the study, so we can go to the next slide, Molly. So as far as the bottom line, what we really learned, of course, nowadays there's this huge discussion on white fragility and American society being a lot more racist, and all of us as white people being more racist than we perhaps even realize that we are. And we do know that there is this huge sector of white American society that's vulnerable to white supremacist recruitment. And I don't like to think that just anybody can become a white supremacist. From listening to these people, I've realized that there are true vulnerabilities to getting pulled in. And one is coming from deprived, chaotic, or violent backgrounds, having subtle racism or in their families or their social surrounds, or even overt racism everywhere around them, which tends to happen more in the South, or that they're otherwise struggling to thrive on a psychosocial, emotional, or economic level. And we know that this constitutes a huge recruitment base in the US and also in other countries. Tim Zoll, I just saw that you joined. Welcome, nice to have you here. And then second major finding is white supremacism recruitment relies heavily on conferring a sense of belonging. We heard over and over again, belonging and being given a sense of purpose, a significance, even a sense of honor to those who join. Joining seems like gaining a family and becoming a warrior for one's race, something that can be really important on a human level. And we've also learned that white supremacist ideology is conferred in a stepwise fashion. And for me, this is similar in ways to aspects of cult indoctrination. So separating the recruit from interactions with outsiders, things that would be reality testing possibilities, along with putting strict demands for adherence to group norms, beliefs, and at time, depending on which group it is, to carry out violence and to mark one's body with indelible signs of loyalty to the group, usually in the form of tattoos. We also see conspiracy theories, online funneling algorithms on all our social media, and disinformation. And I would say disinformation recently, even coming from the highest offices of our nation, all contribute to reinforcing the so-called truth of the white supremacist ideology. And lastly, exiting white supremacism is painful, can feel like losing one's world, family, and requires, in many cases, support for redirection and rehabilitation, as well as support for tattoo removal. So let's go to the next slide. That's you, Molly, so you go ahead.
So I will take from here. So one of the things that Anne mentioned at the very beginning was that these people in our sample, at least, and we can't draw general conclusions, but we can say what we found in our sample in particular, had very chaotic and in some cases traumatic early childhoods. And so we measured the levels of adverse childhood experiences, which are also called ACEs. This was a study that was done initially in the late 90s, looking at a sample of kids and measuring 10 different vulnerabilities. And these were physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, having a household member with a mental illness, having a household member who was incarcerated, having a household member who had substance abuse challenges, and having domestic violence in the household. And we found high levels of ACEs in many of the participants, and the most common was having a household member who struggled with substance abuse. 18 out of the 34 people in our sample struggled with substance abuse, or had a family member who struggled with substance abuse, and 9 of those people eventually struggled with their own substance abuse as well. And there were others other than the 9 who had their own personal substance abuse problems. But if you look at their childhoods, that's a pretty large proportion. Other key vulnerabilities that weren't included in the original ACEs study, I should have said that the ACEs study found that having higher levels of these 10 specific experiences made people more at risk for a whole slew of negative physical and mental health outcomes, including heart disease and criminality. So, really running the gambit. But other key vulnerabilities that aren't included in the ACEs, but were very common in our sample, were family conflict and dysfunction in general. So even if it wasn't, as far as domestic violence, it was lots of fighting in the household or among different family members. And then also specific prior traumatic experiences, also experienced by 16 people. And these included sexual abuse, sexual assault, the murder of a sibling, and also things that challenged people's identities, like a cancer diagnosis. Another finding was about their motivations. And so many people might assume that the people who join white supremacist groups are motivated by white supremacism. But what we found is that they were much more motivated by more existential needs. So the desire to belong and the need for significance were the 2 most common. Some might argue that the desire to belong falls under the umbrella of needing significance, but we separated them out to look at who is looking for a family and who is looking to matter. And so the desire to belong is that family aspect. And it's unsurprising when you look at how many people had family dysfunction that they would be motivated to join a group based on the idea that they might be accepted by this group. And then the need for personal significance goes into that greater cause idea that somebody wants to feel like they're important and that they're contributing to a cause that they care about. And so, as I mentioned, they weren't motivated by white supremacy. Only 13 in the sample were at all motivated to join their groups, and it wasn't the primary motivation for many of them, but they were at all motivated by these forms of bigotry. So 2 were motivated by racism, 3 by anti-Semitism, 5 by xenophobia, primarily about Hispanic and Turkish immigrants, depending on the country, and 4 were motivated by Islamophobia. So these aren't huge proportions of the sample. But once they got into the group, the ideological indoctrination really ramps up. So once they were in the groups, 20 people admitted to dehumanizing Black people, 23 admitted to dehumanizing Jews, 11 admitted to dehumanizing immigrants, and 7 admitted to dehumanizing Muslims. And this doesn't necessarily capture everyone who did every level of dehumanization. But it is important to look at how much ideological indoctrination there is compared to the actual motivations of people joining these groups. And I think this one is Anne.
Okay, and then another thing that we found as far as a commonly reported motivation was engaging in a noble cause. And I know Jeff's talked about this many times when I've heard Jeff speak about believing that what he was doing was actually a good thing and was good for the race, and that the people that were working with him in the NSM, and others told us this too, that one guy said that he was a warrior for his race, others said that they believed that they were heroes, and all of them began to believe that their whiteness made them special, that they had an honorable cause, and that they were indeed fighting for their rights. And they would look forward even to the next generation or even to their grandparent generation. And they'd be told this in the ideological indoctrination: you're not doing this just for yourself, you're doing this for your grandchildren, because there's not going to be any white people left and you need to protect white people. Adherence to the 14 words, which I haven't memorized. Jeff, you want to read those out for us? Do you remember them?
The 14 words would be, we must secure the existence of our race and a future for white children.
Thank you. Yeah. So it leads people to believe that they're not only acting in their own interest, but also in the interest of future generations. Thank you for remembering that. I couldn't remember it offhand. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Let's see, I think this is me too. So when we look at how white supremacist groups operate, in my view, they manipulate the needs and vulnerabilities of their recruits. And in some ways, they're acting in a cult-like indoctrination methods, which I already mentioned in the beginning. And the pre-existing vulnerabilities of the recruits are really manipulated, especially for young men, even for underage. I know, Jeff, in your group, you didn't take anybody under 18, but people have actually told me, I zeroed in on this kid because he didn't have a father and I could be a father figure for him, and I could bring him into the group, and by mentoring, they would bring them in. Also, white women have told me that other white men felt like protectors for them, and this brought them in. But over and over again, there's this strong sense of specialness that is being conveyed. One guy who was quite smart but didn't do well in school, had some kind of learning disabilities and maybe emotional issues in his family, read a lot of white supremacist literature and said that he felt he was in on secret knowledge and it was being conferred to him, and that made him important. And the NSM has all their ranks, and people would talk about going up in the ranks and feeling that they had gained a sense of achievement. And this is particularly important for people that weren't achieving in their lives, or maybe did poorly in school because of chaotic home lives or just learning issues, but were smart and could get ahead. One woman told about being involved in a radio show. She had dropped out of she finished high school, but she didn't go on to university as she probably would have. And she's a very smart young woman. And instead, she got into a white supremacist group and ended up helping to host a radio show. So you can imagine how that would make her feel important, and that she was self-actualizing in a way, compared to getting off her track. And she'd gotten off her track after being raped, and raped by a Hispanic man. So again, reinforcing this, once she got into the group of, that's who they are, that all Hispanics are like that, not just this one person, generalizing it to everybody. Recruits are also endowed with a heroic sense of purpose, as we said, saving the white race. And for me, that's psychologically a lot about saving their own inner hurt child from past experiences of emotional deprivation and pain. And as far as the cult-like practices which are carried out to indoctrinate, we've had Stephen Hassan on a couple of times. Oh, I guess only once. But he's written, I think, 3 or 4 books on cults, and he really explains carefully how cults work. And I wouldn't say that white supremacists are cults, but that they use some of the same things. So when you cut off ties with those that don't adhere to your ideology, it makes it harder. And ISIS does the same thing, and especially with converts. When converts convert into Islam and then get a Takfiri view of Islam, they don't have anybody to talk to reality test and to say, this isn't actually it. And this is what white supremacist groups do. They create a very strict in-group, reject the people that aren't in it, and demand ideological adherence. In some cases with the KKK, taking part in secret ceremonies, and they band together for demonstrations, and then their enemies come out and attack, and this creates more of a sense of camaraderie, and it's us against them. And then they're encouraged for self-defense and sometimes for aggressive action as well. And then putting indelible marks on your body of, I'm part of this group, also signifies loyalty to the group. And this is particularly powerful in prison gangs, but powerful in other areas too. And maybe TM will talk a little bit at the end about his work erasing the hate, helping people to cover up or remove tattoos when they've left these groups and left these ideologies, and how it's difficult when you've marked yourself indelibly to actually leave a group like that. So let's go to the next slide. And I think that goes back to Molly then.
Yeah, this one is me. So I mentioned in a previous slide that most of the people weren't motivated by outright hate, but that doesn't mean that they weren't primed unwillingly to kind of buy into the ideologies that they were getting. Many of the participants explained how they had grown up, and they didn't necessarily believe that what they had been influenced by was racist. But I'm going to read these quotes and listen to how people speak about how they had grown up, because there's this inkling of superiority of white people that isn't hateful, that isn't angry, but could make somebody more easily adapt to a hateful ideology because the seeds are already there. So one person says, sorry, I need to get this window out of the way. Whatever. So one person says, growing up in the South, I was always a good person. If you treated me good, I will treat you good no matter the color of your skin. But he says, growing up, my grandfather would say you never saw a successful Black person. So he says, I was never into any white supremacism or ideology growing up. But then very soon after, he says, I have these preconceived ideas that white people are better. So there's this disconnect that it's not hateful, that you feel that it's not hateful at all, but the seeds are there. So somebody else says, I never considered myself a racist. I never hated anyone for the color of their skin. I had that instilled to me as a kid. So he says his mom told him never to hate, but that he shouldn't mix races and that whites were better than them. His grandfather was in the KKK. So you can see how somebody might be more primed to take on an ideology if that's already what they're growing up around.
No, I would just add to that, that it's, for these people, it's seen more as factual, that it's just a fact, you know, that white people are supreme, and that their social surround is putting that out as factual versus anything to do with hate. But then you can get pulled into the hate, and we can discuss whether it is hate at some point too. But something that I find really interesting in these interviews, and I started diving into it deeper with everybody, is that anti-Semitism across the board seems to be the most often indoctrinated, but it's not pre-existing, and the Jews are blamed for every world evil. And when I first started hearing this, I just kind of, wrote it down and, I recorded it, listened, but then it struck me that some of these people, like the woman I mentioned who was raped by a Hispanic, you can totally understand how she might generalize hate to all Hispanics. Or you can understand with everything that we see in media with Black people disproportionately in movies, on TV shows, doing criminal acts, so that people get it in their mind, maybe Black people are criminals, which isn't fair at all. Or if you live in a neighborhood where there's different races and ethnicities and there's violence between them, that you would get these ideas. But over and over again, when people started talking to me about getting indoctrinated into anti-Semitism, I started to ask, did you know any Jews? Did you ever have a bad experience with the Jew? What did you know about Jews before that? And people just tell me, I never saw a Jew in my life. And I had no idea who Jews were. But after they got deeply into these groups, they had such strong views about Jews, which was very interesting to me. And so the white supremacist groups indoctrinate the deepest hatred for Jews, and they see them as an illegitimate ruling elite, which is really interesting, because one of our interviews recently, we had a woman that she was so articulate about that she was in a skinhead group. And she said, when I got pregnant and had a baby, and I went back to live with my mother and my stepfather, she had some chaos in her childhood. And I was poor and I was struggling. And I had all this hate that had been put in me about Blacks and minorities. And I was always told they're getting all the jobs and I can't get a job. And here I am, a poor white woman, and now I'm a poor white woman with a little child. And luckily I had my mother to take care of my child. But she said, I started to realize there was no Hispanic that had ever taken my job. There was no Black person that had ever taken my job. And the reason I was struggling is that the corporations refused to pay us a decent living wage. And we don't have daycare, we don't have healthcare, all the things that everybody's struggling with. And she said, we actually should be united, all of us together, which raises the question of these bigger societal issues of, are there, is there, this division happening for other reasons? And then if you're going to look up to some kind of ruling elite, the hatred is pointed towards Jews, seeing them as an illegitimate ruling elite and blaming them for running the world. And in some ways, this goes all the way back to the propaganda of the elders of Zion, which goes back to Jews being forced to be moneylenders because they didn't have any other choices in Europe, and then being blamed that they held the debts of other people and always pointed at them. But it's just fascinating to me how it's set up, that there's this boogeyman, and that it's a boogeyman that nobody seems to actually have any true experiences with, but they begin to believe it. And some of the ideologies, the Christian identity uses the Bible to support this view of Jews. They claim that Jews are descended from Satan, or that they were not God's chosen people, as claimed in the Christian and the Jewish scriptures. And in exiting white supremacism, many people were surprised to meet Jews and find them very similar to themselves. I mean, no surprise, right? And this underlies the importance of creating dialogues and interactions of this type to foster rehabilitation and reintegration, and maybe also for prevention. And again, TM can speak on some of the work that he's done with that, which is really kind of cool. So I guess I jumped to this other last interview. That's my last point, about how one person was very articulate about some of the economic issues, because I think it's hard for people to see systemic issues around them and understand what's really going on. It's much easier just to be fed some kind of conspiracy theory and just start blaming an outgroup and taking all your anger that way. But anyway, next slide. Is it me or you, Molly? I can't remember.
This is you.
Okay. Oh, okay. So conspiracy theories and disinformation definitely play a role in the ideological indoctrination. And basically, it's conspiracy theories that allow you to blame your frustrations and your failures, which may be personal to you, or they may feel personal to you when you came from a family that was failing, or from a sector of society that was failing, and that hasn't been given what it needs to succeed, which is what we opened with. There is this whole group of vulnerable white people that may not be doing so well because of family issues, because of societal issues, that's vulnerable to then take on an ideology that blames outward. And some of the blame does belong outward, but not where it's directed by conspiracy theories. And it's directed towards a perceived enemy that's seen as set out to destroy the group. And what I forgot to say on the last slide is the claim usually is that Jews are going to raise minorities above white people and destroy white people in the conspiracy claim. And so Jews are out to get them. And in this sense, this is where I see big similarities between Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and white supremacists, that these groups then begin to see their own violence and their own aggression as defensive. So they don't see themselves as aggressors, they see themselves as defending their group and providing safety, and that aggression is necessary to survive. And then they're kept isolated, as I've repeated over and over again now, from cognitive dissonance by having to adhere to the ideology, staying within the group. And Jeff's noted that a number of times, and other people in the NSM, that people were told they're not supposed to date outside of their race, but secretly they would. And it's kind of funny when you find out all these guys are dating Black women or Indian women or whatever it happens to be, while claiming to hate these other groups. Unfortunately, we have to find some answer for social media algorithms, because this is deeply intensifying and making a funneling effect when disinformation comes in. And we also have other actors playing into this. With QAnon, there's good evidence that Russians may be feeding it, the bots, the same things that were happening in our previous election. And that would be anybody that's an enemy to the US would love to sow division among us. And what a great way to do it. So let's see. And then again, whenever conspiracy theory can feed in and use scriptures, it becomes really, really powerful. So now you're seeing a lot of news with QAnon, and QAnon is peripheral to white supremacism, but with the Capitol, we saw an overlap between the two groups. And we have one interview where we had somebody that was following both. But if you manage to co-opt religious beliefs like the Christian identity does, or QAnon, if you manage to get religious leaders to believe your conspiracy theory, then they can influence huge groups of people. And that's what happened with ISIS too, and with Al-Qaeda. They got religious leaders to issue fatwas in support of what they were doing. And we saw this with suicide terrorism too, that fatwas were made on behalf of suicide terrorism, even back when the Palestinians were first engaging in it. And once you get religious leaders saying what this group is doing is right, or this conspiracy theory is true, then it becomes even more powerful and more difficult to take people out of, because then you are seen as essentially arguing against their religion. Let's go to the next slide.
So this one is me, findings and about our recruitment strategies. So first, second on the slide, but what we've already mentioned is that vulnerable young people were targeted for recruitment by not all of the groups, but by many of them, because they saw these as people who were looking for an identity and a source of belonging, and that's exactly what they could offer. But vulnerable youth weren't the only targets for recruitment. Active and retired military and law enforcement personnel were also targeted for recruitment. They bring prior knowledge of weapons and tactics. They also bring a sense of discipline and structure to the group. But from the outside as well, they lend an air of legitimacy to the group. So not only do these groups want to recruit these people for their internal operational purposes, but also for future recruitment, that these are people who are patriots and can make their group in turn look as though it's also patriotic, and that it's an important cause for people who are proud of their country. Recruitment strategies occur through leafletting and literature, as well as in-person interactions and social media. And I can say this was actually quite funny that Anne was asking me, leafletting seems very expensive, and she said that somebody else said it seemed very wasteful, pricey, and nobody was going to listen to it. But I flyered, we made a verb out of it, flyered all the time in college for different organizations. It's a very popular strategy for groups in general, because you're handing them out. If somebody drops it on the ground or throws it away, somebody else is going to see it anyway. And the groups can also use these as tactics for being threatening as well. So not only to recruit, but also to scare somebody else of a minority group to see that this group is active in your area. And similarly, they also create spectacles in order to utilize the mainstream media for exposure and recruitment. And militant jihadist groups did this as well. Because if they, do a bunch of these flyers in a primarily Black or Jewish neighborhood, then the news will come and feature it. And then anybody who might be interested in joining knows exactly where this group is active.
In that regard, I'm just going to jump in. Sometimes you have to admire these people. They're so smart, and you think, oh, if you just could grab that smartness and use it for good, because, somebody figuring out how to leaflet in a way that would get national news coverage. And then they said they would show the leaflet on the TV and it would have the phone number and website that you could, then recruit yourself to. And how smart is that?
Do you want to take this one?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, I was trying to be polite. So we have to admit, gender was not well studied in this group. I think in the group of 32, I think we're up to 35 now. And thanks to TM and Jeff for helping us so much to get people to talk to us. But I think we only had 2 or 3 women in the beginning. And today we're getting 2 more, so that's really good. But gender was not well studied in this group and it needs much more attention. And I don't know if Acacia joined today, but Jeff's sidekick at the NSM, Acacia Dietz, has said that it's really important looking at the roles of women, and she herself was one, and was an important propagandist, and now she's important in fighting against it. But what we've seen, that women appear to have lesser roles in most groups, but in Acacia's case, here's somebody that did have an important role and, was really skilled at finding out how to get on social media, even when there were takedowns, how to reconfigure it so it wouldn't be taken down. And the men do talk about the women. It's not the same as getting a woman herself to tell about her experience, but certainly talked to many skinheads that say the women fought right alongside us. The women were known to be as tough fighters as the men, and but there were lesser of them. And so women are welcomed in some groups, and I'll let Jeff talk about that as well. But so we shouldn't see them discounted as an ideological threat, and we should acknowledge that they can be violent just the same as men, but oftentimes they're seen as breeders, as someone that should be protected by these men. And there's also a difference between prison-based and gang-like groups. The former are much more violent than those that are more political groups and that do not overtly advocate for violence. So even though a group doesn't advocate for violence, there's certainly violence that happens in the demonstrations. And I kept hearing about Antifa from everybody, that Antifa would come out and counter demonstrate to us, which is something that I'm also fascinated with, of who exactly is Antifa and how did you know that they were Antifa? And what I kept hearing is that we're all Black and they tried to punch us and they insulted us, so that's how we knew they were Antifa, or they broke our car windows, or they did this. And so there's definitely this reciprocal radicalization of, you go out to the streets and you bring the news, you bring other people out to the streets to counter protest, and then you bring this, whatever it is, which was always labeled as Antifa, this group of people that is counter violent to you. And even if you're a political group, punches do get thrown and windows do get broken. But with the gangs, I would say, one person actually talked about getting an adrenaline high, that when he went out to fight, it was like taking a drug. And people also do talk about taking a lot of drugs, but that there was a high in this excitement of going to fight. And one woman said, when the groups the skinheads got together, if they didn't find somebody else to fight, they would end up fighting each other. So the skinhead gang and the prison-based groups, and the prison-based are also criminal, are extremely violent. So let's go to the next slide. Is that me, Molly? Okay. So we also see that ebbs and flows of engagement are common. So as people start to get disillusioned, they may step back, but that's our whole friendship group because they've isolated themselves. And the friends keep calling them and pulling them back in. Some of them feel, I can't re-enter society. I don't know how to. I'm all tattooed up. They don't find something else, so they go in and out of the group. We definitely found that doxing has a serious effect. And doxing is really interesting. And you know, it's a question of should it be done or should it not be done? And I would say the result that you can see from doxing is that if you do it to somebody that's actively in the group, it does make them think. I mean, if they are losing their job, if their friends are denouncing them, or people that know them, their family members are denouncing them, if something that they thought they could keep, you know, kind of a separate, secret life, suddenly comes out into general knowledge, it does have an effect. And some people have said that they quit when they were doxxed or attacked by groups that they identified as Antifa, rightly or wrongly, I don't know. But so in that case, you could possibly argue for doxing as getting people out, getting them out in quite a traumatic way though. But doxing years after seems like a really revengeful and cruel thing to do. And some people were still fearful years after leaving groups. And that makes me sad, you know, that someone wants to change themselves or has fundamentally changed themselves and, you know, would be outed in a cruel way. It just seems vengeful. But that's my personal view on that. We certainly saw that spontaneous de-radicalization occurs, and the way that we kept hearing it occurring was just chance positive interactions with members of minority groups. So sometimes people would be out leafleting and a Black person would take their leaflet and engage them in conversation and say, you know, why do you believe this? And just be actually really nice with them. Or somebody on Facebook from a different minority group would engage with them in a nice way. Or they would be lonely because being a white supremacist is kind of lonely. And they would just decide to talk to somebody that normally they would shun and find out that it was a positive interaction. And they'd be like, that's strange. And on the other hand, they would also be getting disillusioned when their group leaders or their other members weren't adhering to the ideology of the group, like dating members from minority groups or doing things, or just not being trustworthy, not being good friends, not doing their work in the group. And that this would lead to a disillusionment and a de-radicalization over time. As far as the barriers to disengagement, definitely being isolated in an echo chamber and the ideological fusion that happens with that, tattoos. A number of people mentioned going to a therapist and having the therapist afraid of them. In one case, a guy went to a Jewish therapist. I think it was positive interaction in that case. But, you know, just realizing that his therapist was Jewish and that he had been in this hate group must have been, you know, kind of interesting. But I think it's at least 2 cases, people said their therapist said, I don't know how to deal with this, which, you know, to me, I think that's a failure on the side of our profession of, you know, equip yourself or at least find the referral for this person, somebody that's not afraid of them. Because, you know, if you're trying to exit and the person you ask for help can't even see you as a human being, that's really sad. And then friends, family, and finances can all be barriers to exit. So Jeff can tell you, you know, in his case, he had built his business in part around the group. And that makes it hard to exit as well. So I think, is that the end? Yeah, so what we thought is maybe Jeff and TM, you could say your thoughts about the report, and you know most of the people that were interviewed, so, and you have your own experience in your groups, and then we just open it up to a discussion with the group that's here.
Okay. Since we can't hear Jeff or can't see him, I would say I would just start with one thing. First of all, it's great work. The report is great. I read the whole thing. It's really long, but it's worth the read. And it's very correct, since, as you said, we know most of the people, and the report, it really reflects what happened in their lives, what was driving them in the way in the groups, and was driving their way out, and their struggles in the aftermath. One thing, we talked about women in the movement, and you said there were only like a handful of women initially in the report, in the study, which we are bringing more into now, and where we'll see that. They're seldomly leaders, that is right. And in some groups, it's really separated. With my background in KKK groups, you see there's some KKK groups where women are completely separated. They have their own organization called LOTIs, which means Ladies of the Invisible Empire. They're not full members of the KKK group, while other groups are fully integrate them, and they can actually achieve some ranks, but usually not very high. You don't see a state leader who's a woman. I don't think there's a single example. You don't see a national, international leader in the clan who was a woman. You don't see that in other groups. You see it in Germany. It's a little bit different. You have some party or neo-Nazi groups that have women as leaders. That happens, but it's rather rare. That's just with that. I wanted to continue, which I made a couple of notes, so forgive me if I mix it up. When people disengage, and there's a couple of problems there in the disengagement process. One is the political de-radicalization. De-radicalization is a very, very important process when somebody gets out, because it's often that awakening, oh, I don't hate anybody anymore, but the radicalization is still there, because you say, I don't want to hate black people anymore, but you still haven't met any. You still haven't dealt with all your prejudices. With the Jewish community, the same, and so on. And one big problem, we will come back to the Jewish part in a minute, but one big part is the political de-radicalization, which is also very important, because communism was always a big enemy in that movement, which is also driven by the Jewish conspiracy. They were supporting communism, etc., backed up with proof in the 1920s. All the filmmakers, they were all communists and everything. Then you had in the 50s, 60s, when a lot of screenwriters and actors and producers were banned in Hollywood for being communists, and a lot of them were indeed Jewish. And this fit right into that conspiracy theory.
Let's make that a claim that they were all Jewish, communists, okay?
Well, okay, but that's what they said. Right. And you can compare that with, you mentioned QAnon. And yes, some farmers who get out, who were in there a long time, and who had a lot of political hatred because of that. And that's a lot of them that are buying into the Jewish conspiracy, especially those, have a very, very political hatred. And that makes it very hard at some stages when they're out not too long, for a year or 2 or 3, they are prone to follow the conspiracy theories like QAnon as well, because it's the same pattern. And the good thing is they can say, I'm no more racist. I don't hate black people. I don't hate Jews. No, it's the liberals. And then it starts name calling. Libtards, they're demonic, they're evil. You see, the others, dehumanization, they're destroying us. And we're on that crusade against them to save our people, which is the Americans, the conservatives. And this is what happens there. They're not even Americans. They deny their rights to be Americans, and they take their humanity away. And this is like almost like a substitute for what they had in the white supremacist movement. And this is very hard to work on them on that, so they don't fall into this, because they have a vacuum. They don't have found a new home yet. And then they are buying into that. They don't think it's a bad thing because, hey, I'm no more racist. I'm no more anti-Semitic. That is the one part. When they get out, safety issues are very, very important too, because some face retaliation from their groups. And this is very hard to help them when it has come that far, because it is hard to protect them. You can't just go and pick them up and hide them. Sometimes they don't want to talk to the police or whatever. And sometimes their families getting threatened. And this is very, very difficult. This is why we encourage somebody who's getting out not to create a situation like that. Because it's not like you sending a 2-week notice to the Klan. Hi, I'm getting out on May 31st. You know, no, it is. Our advice is, well, to hide, actually not to go there anymore. And it's often accepted by those groups because, well, you need a timeout. Just often lying helps. Hey, I need a timeout because whatever, I have personal problems. For the most part, they leave you alone. They will bug you a little bit and try to get you back in. At some point, they will just give up for the most part. So don't announce it. But still, you fall into the vacuum. You have no more support network. This is why groups like QAnon are like a welcome substitute for that. Another thing, erasing the hate. We talked about tattoos. So tattoos, a lot of people in that movement get tattoos because it shows their loyalty to that group. Sometimes it gets forced on you in prison gangs. You got to have it. You got your gang patch with a pyramid and showing your rank and everything. And then you start collecting swastikas and stuff like that. These are the prison tattoos. But also outside of prison, it is even in Germany, everybody in that movement has tattoos, maybe not as much as swastikas because it's forbidden there, but it's there. And that makes re-entry in society very, very hard, especially if you have it in your face. We had examples like that, many actually in the US, in another country, in New Zealand, for example, which is really, really, really hard, or on your neck or on your hands. But even if they are on other body parts, your upper body, on your chest, on your legs, you can't even take your shirt off in front of your kids. You can't go to the beach. And let me bring in one example when I really realized that many years later, what kind of personal pain it also causes. I remember, and it was not even a swastika tattoo, it was just the word skinhead. And in Germany, skinheads are just seen as pretty anti-immigrant, violent too. And I was out for maybe 2 years. I still have that tattoo, and I went to a water park with my kids. And we went to a slide, went up the stairs there. And there was a Turkish woman with her little child in front of me, and I had my child. Seems normal, but she looked over her shoulder, saw me, looked at my tattoo, and all of a sudden I saw the fear in her eyes. And I was like frozen because I didn't know what to say. I was out. I had no problem with that person. I didn't care if she was Muslim, but I didn't know what to say. I wanted to scream, hey, I'm not like this anymore. But you can't run around screaming at everybody, hey, I'm not like this anymore. I have a sign around their neck. This is why we came up with that campaign, Erasing the Hate, where we worked with tattoo shops all across the country to remove those tattoos for free or cover them up, or laser removal, which is much more expensive. We are expanding the program. There's a lot of factors that I haven't thought about in the first 3 years. Really, who deserves a tattoo? Because I had a couple of cases where somebody got a tattoo lying to us. They had a problem with the court and just needed to be covered up so they don't go back to prison. But even in that case, it might help. Or just to hide it, or that freebie of getting the tattoo removed. And I'm working with a Jewish tattoo artist who refuses to this day to join me in this work because he says he would like to, those people chose to have it. And when has somebody shown that they're not like that anymore? So help. It's very tricky, and the safety issues as well. And well, is the person really out? Is that person still a happening? So these are tricky parts that we're facing, but it's important. It's very important for the re-entry society,
TM,
for their mental health tattoos removed.
TM, that's all great. If you're going to continue talking, maybe turn off the video because your internet's not so strong.
Okay, let me turn it off. Usually it's fine, but
Because we're not, you're
I'm
breaking up.
on my iPad today. Let me turn the video off. Okay,
Yeah,
is it better now?
yeah,
okay.
a little bit better. Yeah.
Okay, I can, otherwise I can drop out and join on my phone, join back, and we can have Jeff take over, and then I continue mine in a minute.
Yeah, try again. Yes, please.
Okay, just give me 2 minutes.
Because what you have to
Okay.
say is really good. And just at the end, it was breaking up. Okay, Jeff, you're up.
Okay.
All right. First of all, great, excellent work on the report, ladies. That was very well done and detailed, and it covered a lot. I'd like to say one of the things that I think is really an important factor in radicalization is fear. Fear is something that motivates a lot of people. A lot of the people, the majority of the people that are involved are completely motivated by fear. They fear that the white race is going to be wiped out, that white genocide is happening, and that's a really high motivating factor for a lot of people. When you back somebody into a corner, and psychologically they feel they're backed into a corner, that's when they're most likely to fight. The only thing I would disagree with in the report is the doxing. I know you had a balanced perspective on that, but in my experience, and with a lot of the people we've worked with and helped getting out, and even in my own trajectory, whenever I was doxed, I doubled down on my activities. I did twice as much. I got more angry, more dedicated, and more pushed. Now, there is a few cases, I can think of maybe 3, 4, 5 at the most out of hundreds of people that I know that have come out that left because they were doxxed. And in these cases, in my experience, the ones that left when they were doxxed were people that were not ideologically committed, that they came in for other reasons, and they were kind of hanger-ons or lightly involved. So if you're lightly involved and you're not completely indoctrinated and you're not completely in this cult-like environment, it's easier for something like that to push you out because you're not that committed. So you're at that point. So in some ways, yes, it has worked in some ways, but typically when someone's being doxxed, that further radicalizes them. It's just like with the fighting, when there would be fist fights with Antifa or with other organizations or individuals, or even pressure from the authorities, police visits, FBI visits, things like that. A lot of times those things in the mind of the extremist or the mind of a radical, they are, that's a justification. Like, well, we're right. That's why we're being, persecuted by the system or persecuted by these other people. And it's easy to place labels on those people as well. So, for example, we talked a little bit about Antifa. For us, for those of us that were in the National Socialist movement, a broad brush could be painted with Antifa. There's people in there that are anarchists, there's people that are communists, and there's people that are just regular, on regular ends of the political spectrum, but you just throw them into that box and paint them into that category, and they're just all lumped in there. And this is typical of the extremist mindset where everyone is labeled and you just paint everybody with a broad brush. And that's an interesting point that was brought up earlier in the program today, was that a lot of these people had never even, or they believed they'd never even met a Jewish person. There's one case that we're working on right now with a man that's in his 60s. And as far as he knows, he's never met a Jewish person. So that's one of the people that we have on our list to go introduce to the Jewish community here locally, and another young man as well. So that's something that's in the works. So having those interactions and having those experiences with people from other cultures, from other races, and from other religions, it dissipates that fear. It dissipates those concerns, those worries. And a lot of those worries are, and it all boils down to and goes back to fear. is they are fearful. And I'm glad that you guys, ladies, excuse me, I'm glad that you ladies covered that, how a lot of the factors that bring people into this, and and a lot of them do, myself included. I believed that I was fighting for a noble cause. I believed that I was doing something good. So one of the things we do at Beyond Barriers when we're talking with people, we don't tell them that they're wrong. We know they're wrong. Everyone listening here today knows that they're wrong, but they don't know they're wrong. That's their truth. So how do we get them to see reality versus their truth or their reality? So what we do, instead of saying you're wrong, and getting them to double down, we offer them different perspectives. We say, well, what do you think about this? Or how about this? And give them, plant those seeds so they have other things that they can think about. And it doesn't typically happen like the snap of a fingers, where someone goes, well, on this day, I'm no longer radical. It's all done. I've figured it out. It doesn't typically work that way, especially when you're dealing with someone that's been radicalized over a long period of time. So planting those little seeds, causing those seeds of doubt, I mean, that's how it worked for me personally. Getting out is having those different perspectives, thinking about those things, and quite often dwelling on those things for some time, and then them adding up. And finally, when you've de-radicalized, and I want to take a step back there, we like to get people to disengage before they de-radicalize, because disengagement is the first major step to get them away from the group, to get them thinking on their own and having their own identity and thinking outside of that. And once they're disengaged, the de-radicalization process is much easier because they're thinking clearer. They're outside of that bubble. They're outside of that cult-like environment, because being involved in these organizations is all consuming, depending on how deep you're in. In the organization that I was involved in, it was all consuming. Your social circles, your political circles, the group functioned like a family in a lot of ways. And as you mentioned, it had ranks and structure and things like that. So especially for people coming out of trauma-based issues, having that structure was very important. And there was a lot of questions that were asked, and I don't want to take up, I don't know how much time we have, but if there's any specific questions on any of those things from the audience or from you ladies, I'd be happy to answer those.
Guys, I don't mind being called you guys. I'm from the Midwest.
Jeff is from the north. That works.
Exactly.
They say you guys. We here in the south say y'all.
Exactly.
So if I may, can I say something about that?
Yes,
because Jeff said about personal truth, and this is exactly what it is. I just thought too, I'm fighting a noble cause because this was my experience, my personal truth. And he said too, a lot of people, including myself, I've never met a Jewish person until like 2018, and I got out of the movement in 2002. Well, I knew about some like business-wise, but never really met one. And if you don't know any and they are introduced like you a certain way, or you only know the immigrants who you fight on the streets, which means this is your personal truth, and you make it also your political truth versus a objective truth, like, yeah, humans have a nose and two eyes and the sky is blue. This is an objective truth. It's what it is. But a personal truth is based on your experiences at a certain point. And again, you make it also your political truth. And that makes it so tricky. And that doesn't mean that truth is wrong. And it is not, because this is what they experience. This is what they see, means this is their truth. They are not wrong in their own view. And this is what makes it so hard. And this is what Jeff says. It's so important in a dialogue with an extremist, not to tell them they're wrong, because technically they are not wrong how they see it in their personal truth. But we have to show them the objective truth. And this is the tricky part. By telling them they're wrong, it won't work. If I may just really finish my what I have written down earlier when I was breaking up. Is it better now?
Yes, it's much better.
Okay, great. Going back to the Erasing the Hate campaign with the tattoo cover-ups. We are working to expand that, and Jeff is helping me with it too. We will work on that together to expand that a little bit in the next couple months. And some shops, tattoo shops, struggle with that as well, because it's always the question, Is it legit? Can we help somebody? Is the person lying to us? Has the person deserved this freebie that we're giving them? That makes it sometimes really, really difficult. But this is something we're working out. It's still a crucial part in the re-entry into society, that we help them for their personal safety sometimes when they get out of gangs, but also for their mental health. Because sometimes you take off your shirt, you can't go to the beach, like my example with a Turkish Muslim woman and her child. That hurt me deeply. It still hurts me today, thinking of that moment. I wish I could find her and if she remembers that moment and hug her or whatever. It's really hard. And going back, like, okay, many people have never met a Jewish person, or they only met the Black people that were shown to them that fit the stereotype, or only met the immigrants that fit the stereotype or fit the prejudice they're carrying. And a program also in my exit program, and Jeff you will get a fit out of that. We call it now Meeting the Enemy. That is actually part of the name of the movie that Jeff was in that helped him de-radicalize. And it's exactly what it is, meeting the enemy. We're bringing formers together with those that they once hated. And that could be, depending what it is, we saw it in the report, it's not always the whole spectrum. Sometimes it's more anti-Semitism, sometimes it's more homophobia, and sometimes it's Islamophobia, is xenophobia, which is mostly immigrants, but actually anybody who's different. And when we work with people in this de-radicalization process, we realize often that they say, okay, I'm not racist anymore, but they still haven't really met Black people. I'm not anti-Semitic anymore. Well, have you been to a synagogue? Have you met Jewish people? And I remember when I took Jeff to a synagogue the first time, and that was really a great moment, and for him too. And I was so enlightened to see that he continues that journey, and I saw him going back to the same city. It was in Chicago, and then having a Shabbat dinner with those people. Somebody who a lot of people struggle with these things, especially if it's anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is the strongest form of all that hatred that was out there, because they were the main enemy. That I was taught it's not just the Black people are the enemies or the communists. It's the Jews that control all of that, that promote race mixing, that promote communism to destroy the white race. They want to create like a mixed race that is weak and can't stand up anymore. This is what we were taught, and that was our noble cause to fight against it, to save our people, to save our children, to save our grandchildren, the future, like in those 14 words. And this is why it's so important to get them together with those former enemies, with those people that they once hated, in this program that I just newly named Meeting the Enemy. And this is for the other groups actually the same, because a lot of Jews, for example, have never met a former neo-Nazi. And this is sometimes a struggle for them too. But I created, so I call them safe havens, where people know that in these groups. Like I have transgender people that are ready to meet a former who struggle with something like that, Muslims, Jews, whatever it is, and even the political part. And we still have political hatred. And I have one case who's especially hating the other, the political other. And one time we had a dinner and everybody was a liberal on the table pretty much, but him and maybe one other person asked afterwards, well, those libtards were not that bad, huh? And it was funny, actually, he didn't even think about it the whole time, that there were liberals that he actually hates. So this is also part of that, bringing them together and just finding or refining the humanity. And this is why it's so important. This is why I have this program, Meeting the Enemy, refining that humanity in those that you once hated, restoring the humanity. And that helps those people tremendously. And Jeff can maybe say some words about that too, especially how I introduced him to the Jewish community.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree, TM. That, I mean, meeting the people that you once hated and having those experiences, we found that that's one of the most effective ways to reach those people. And I mean, that's the concept of beyond barriers as well, is basically you're trapped behind these barriers. You can't see beyond it. You can't see through them. You're in that echo chamber, in that bubble. And to see that humanity of the so-called other is breathtaking. It really, it's life-changing, it's life-altering, and it's one of the ways, you know, to tap back into that humanity. The humanity, and I know it's a hard thing for a lot of people to understand, that when people get involved in this, because of the narrative, a lot of people have said in the past, and I know we've covered it earlier, but it's not about, they're not motivated by hate in most cases. Hate is developed there, it's fostered there, it is part of it, but it is not the motivating factor. So we have to get back to the motivating factors, which is that compassion or that passion that they had in the beginning to try to do something good. When they realize that this cause that they're a part of is not good, it's not noble, it's not honorable, it's harmful to people, it's harmful to other Americans, it's harmful to other people that live in this country and other human beings. And when they can see the humanity of the other, that's when change happens. And that's where we're making a real difference. Because if you can tap back into that, instead of pushing them back into that corner by doxing them or telling them they're wrong or fighting them, which usually doubles down on the radicalization and extremism, if you can tap back into that humanity, tap into it, show them the humanity of the other, that's when you have long and lasting change. We don't want to force, we can force people to leave their ideology or try to bully them out or things like that, but that also doesn't make a lasting change. We want to psychologically and emotionally make a lasting change that's going to last, that the person's going to stay out, that they're not going to go back into this, and if possible, do something more positive and more productive with their lives, like what TM and I are doing now to try to help change lives.
If I could jump in here, I want to point out something that TM said about preparing the enemy as well to interact. We're a small group, so I can share a very brief story if you don't mind. When I was little, I was not part of this conversation, but I have heard talk of this conversation between my parents and my grandparents about where they were going to send us to school. And my parents wanted to send us to a Jewish school. And my grandparents said, no, you should send them to a public school so that the other kids can meet Jews. And if they don't meet Jewish kids, then they'll be anti-Semitic or they'll be susceptible to anti-Semitism. And my parents said, well, it's not my kid's job to make other kids not anti-Semitic. And they decided, that it was more important for them to be fostering our Jewish identity. And we ended up going to this Jewish school. And who knows what the correct answer is. But I think it's really important to consider that, it's a really good thing for people who are members of minority groups to be interacting with people who are trying to exit. But it can also be very difficult, and it can also feel like that's not my job. I don't want to be the representation of all Jews. I don't want to be the representation of all Black people to this person who's never met a Black person in real life, and now I have the responsibility of representing an entire race. And so I think it's really important what TM said, to prepare all participants in these meetings for what can be very difficult.
Thank you. I agree 100%. And of course, I only put people in that situation that are ready for it. I would never not tell a person that I'm bringing a former white supremacist who maybe has put a Klan robe and the hood over their head just a month before. Those people know it, they're ready for it. But there's often, if it's their first time, they're like a little bit leery sometimes. And they're like, I don't know about that. But in the aftermath, they're all very thankful. I have one example. It was actually in Chicago, and there was a Black church I was speaking at. And there were former KKK leaders coming to the Black church to speak. And there was one person who walked up afterwards and said, I didn't want to come. I wanted to hate you. But after seeing it, she said, can I hug you? And that was really, I started crying there. It was really, really powerful what the person said, because what she thought before, and it was a woman, what she thought before, then learning the story and what actually happened, how it changed, and then the only thing she wanted to hug me and say thank you. How that could change. So it is important to show these stories. That also restores the hope and the faith in minority groups as well, and shows them you don't need to feel helpless when something happens. No, you have a special power actually to help change people, and that helps. Don't feel helpless. No, you've got a great power. And that comes back when something happens. I often get invited because of that. Hey, we heard about that. What can we do now? Please tell us about this, so we don't have to feel helpless. And this is this is awesome. That makes me feel good too. That I'm one more thing to wrap it up, because sometimes I feel I don't deserve this. And I remember my second encounter with the Jewish community. It was at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, and the leader of the AE Pi chapter there. He asked me afterwards and said, TM, how can we continue your mission? I was like, that Jewish kid is asking me, the former Nazi, how we can continue my mission? And that felt wrong for a second, but it shows me how powerful it is, how important it is, what kind of impact it makes if it's done right. And that's just shows also how important this work is. And thank you for your story too.
I want to echo that story, Molly, too. Mubin Sheikh, when we were working on countering ISIS, one time he said in a public speaking, everybody always says, where are the Muslims speaking against ISIS? And he's like, it's not my job. He said, I've got, I don't know, I think he's got 5 kids. I've got 5 kids. I've got to do homework and, make sure they carry their dish over to the sink, and all the things that are his job as a parent, and that he's overwhelmed with, as we all are. And, some of this, and especially if you're countering hate that's been directed at you, it maybe isn't your job, but then the people that agree, in TM's case, that's really beautiful, and we see the results of it. And I want to echo something that Jeff said about fear, and you're right, we need to address that more as a variable and a question, and I'll start doing that. Because it is implied in their statements that I was afraid that the white race is going to be wiped out. I was afraid for my grandchildren, but to actually call it out as a variable is really important. And that we have so many forces in our society ramping up fear. And I've just been reading 2 books. One was by Mark Bray, who's, I would say, pro-Antifa. He's an academic. And then the other, now I'm losing his name, he's a journalist. You remember, Molly, the guy? He's infiltrated in Antifa, but not as an Antifa member, but he managed to get out in Portland. And he's very on the Trump side of things. And I'm listening on Audible to their 2 books. It's like so dichotomous, but so much of it is fear-based. In Mark Bray's case, talking about, if you don't use violence against neo-Nazis, if you don't agree with punch a Nazi in the face, and if you don't agree with doxing, that these people eventually get into the political system and then they do great harm. And he harks back to his own Holocaust history and his family. And I can totally understand where that fear would come from, and anger, but fear. And but what you're saying, Jeff, is so true, that when people are violently attacked, a lot of times it, makes them double down and makes them realize, well, this person's a monster, and all the bad things that I thought about them. And doxing, of course, makes a person terrified and can drive them back into their group. I'm not sure I really listened carefully to what Mark Bray said, because he made a lot of arguments for violent Antifa movements, and I'm not in favor of violence ever. That's these types of violence on either side. But what I'm trying to say is, we all have a responsibility to humanize others, and we all have a responsibility. And I agree, Molly, as a little kid going to school, you didn't have a responsibility, and your parents probably made the best choice for you. But as adults, we have a responsibility to humanize, and we also have a responsibility to fight against these big machines that are making money, and they're news machines, a lot of them, and social media that's making a lot of money with algorithms to fight against the things that are spreading fear in our society that then underlies wanting to hate because you're so scared. And that's bad news for all of us. But anyway, does anybody else want to say anything? And our chatters have been kind of quiet. I was waiting to see if anybody wanted to ask a question. You're most welcome to. Jump in, anybody. DC, do you want to say something? You've been saying a few things in the chat. You want to tell us about your KK rally that you went to?
I can. And just to do a video, just to add to context. So I don't really say this to blow me up. I say this because this is all God, and this will let you know that God exists, because there's no way in the world this would have happened without him. So probably 2013, and it's actually on YouTube. It's they put Chad Martin, somebody recorded, put Chad Martin versus the KKK, but they came and did a Klan rally in full regalia. By the end of the conversation we had, they had pulled up their mask. The guy shook my hand, and I was like, "You do know by your own rules, you're not supposed to be touching my hand." He jerked his hand back. We both started laughing. They said, "Man, you're nothing like we thought. We heard you do a lot for the community. We actually want to help." So they took up a donation of money, food, and clothes for the women's shelter that I volunteer at. And the guy shook my hand and he was like, "See, we're not that bad." And I was like, wait a minute. He's looking for validation from an African-American male? Like, what? But it did make me see something. It made me see that you don't have to make somebody pull their walls down. All you have to do is make them interested enough to want to look over their own wall that they've put up.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
How about you, Roba? Did you want to say something? You put something in the quote. All
Can
right.
you hear?
Yes, we can.
That's great. I spent the greater part of an hour trying to get on here this morning.
Oh, maybe that's why we have fewer people today.
That's
I'm
why
sorry.
I'm telling you this. I want to let you know, I can't even make myself visible. So what you guys are doing right now with the hate that's going on, the fear, and people being driven into corners from which it's hard not to hate just by showing your humanity. It's a beautiful thing. It touches lives. It touches my life. And please, please, I love that you're out there. And let's just please keep doing the work. Now more so than ever.
Thank you, Roba. How about you, Harjit? Do you want to say anything? You always have good comments. Is Harjit still with us? Oh, maybe not. Well, maybe Jeff and TM, you'd like to close. Molly, do you want to say anything else?
Nope, that's all I got.
Yeah, I could add something here. As a psychology practicum student, 1989 to 1990, I worked with a white supremacist inpatient with a borderline personality disorder. And I wrote up my doctoral project for the professional school about him, the role of racism and also Satanism within borderline personality structures. And I basically, my main point, and I do a lot of private writing about this to this day, is there's a structural congruence as well as an intersection between social pathology and psychopathology. It's the same process on different levels and they intersect to perpetuate one another. So racism has that function.
Can you talk a little bit about the black and white and the victim kind of thing with borderline?
Yeah, because borderlines use splitting as a defense, denial as a defense, and projection as a defense, which is precisely what white supremacists do. And this guy was a white supremacist. And I have a lot of quotes from him in the project. And, basically he was saying, if a Black person would ever become president, he's writing this again in he's saying this again, 1990 or 89, that somebody would kill him. It wouldn't happen. He said the same about women. He was anti-Semitic also, but was confused about that. He was a very bright kid, 16-year-old kid that validates what everybody else is saying. He came from a family with an alcoholic mother who was abusive and beat him for years until he retaliated. She needed stitches in her head and he gets incarcerated in the inpatient unit after that. He's abused
Thank
by
you.
her.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Maybe we should explain just a little bit of splitting, that if you're especially in an abusive home, the parts of you that your parent didn't like or punished you for, or projected onto you of, you're a hateful child because I had you, whatever, or you're a child, you split that off, and it's this other that you can't stand. And then later you find somebody else to actually project it onto. So if you fall into white supremacism and they give you someone to project it onto, and whenever you get in touch with that hated part of yourself, you get scared. And you get scared and you get riled up, and it can move you very quickly into violence, especially for males where violence is considered appropriate. And if you're in a group that's telling you to be violent. So Robert, it's really interesting to have you here. And I don't know if you have any link to it. You could put it in the chat. We put it.
No, I could put it, it's an unpublished doctoral, what's the equivalent of a dissertation? I'm also a sociologist specializing in race ethnic conflict, but that goes back to 1980. But anyway, so it's just, I don't have it online where I could give a link to it. But if you tell me a way I could get this online to share with people, I'd be happy to do it. I'm just not really super tech savvy.
Yeah, probably just write it up into a short article. It would be nice.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll think of doing that then.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So,
And by the way, I like this kid. He was anti-everything, extremely homophobic also. But I understood the depth of despair within his psyche and the split in it. And he could have been such a good person with such a different background. And at the very end, when I wrote this up, he said, good, at least something good will come out of all this.
Okay, well then you need to write another article for today. And we'd love to see it. Send it to us, we can publish it. But anyway.
I could send you a physical copy.
Oh, no, you have to write it up as a case.
Okay.
Too much to do.
Yeah,
But,
okay, got it.
Anyway, I don't know if Jeff's disappeared. Jeff, do you have any closing comments that you want to make?
I'm still here. I just want to say, on closing on a positive note, thank you everybody for the great comments and the great commentary and everything, and excellent report again, ladies. But I want to say, in closing on a positive note, prevent is really what we hope to be striving for, and we hope that the U.S. government considers programs for schools where, from a very young age, we can better educate and better understand one another, different ethnicities, different races, different religions. If we have that interaction in schools from a very young age, and we bring these different cultures together and put that together in schools, that preventing will help us to combat this in the future, so we don't have these type of, we're not struggling with these type of things in the future. Of course, we have to, the work we do at Beyond Barriers, at Change, and other organizations like ours, is to help the people get out, but preventing it in the first place would be ideal. If we don't have work to do to get people out, that would be better. That would be better for humanity, for the country. If we can better educate people coming up, we will have smaller numbers going into these extremist groups in the future, because a lot of the fear-based misunderstandings of other peoples and other religions and backgrounds can be dissipated through understanding and through education.
Totally agree with you, Jeff. And what Molly and I have really been struck with in looking at these interviews is just how, if the people had some help with the struggles in their lives, maybe white supremacist groups wouldn't have been that help that they turned to. And also, if they had understood perhaps what they were going into, they wouldn't have. So totally agree with you on prevention. And I would say on ISIS and Al-Qaeda for years, I've been saying we need to do inoculation. We need to teach, probably in civics classes, maybe 10-year-olds. I don't remember when we went through civics and if they still go through civics at the time when I went through civics. I think it was 6th grade. It was really fun. I loved that class. But you can teach, you can inoculate with the ideologies, and you risk that somebody will get interested in the ideology in a bad way. But if you teach them what this rests upon and why it's false. And what I've been really struck with, we just had a dinner last night and we were talking about some of these issues. And it really made me realize that the white supremacist blaming of the Jews does go back to the elders, the protocols of the elders. Am I saying that right? Of Zion, the protocols of Zion. And
Also the elders of Zion.
oh, elders of Zion. Okay, thank you. But are these two different things? Okay. So, but anyway, and as TM, as you said, I never really thought of linking Jews with communism too. You know, that goes back to Europe and to Soviet Jews, you know, seeing the possibility of a good society and communism when communism was thought to be a good idea. And, you know, being some of the thinkers and movers in society. And, you know, and everybody woke up to maybe it's not a good idea, but to understand where some of these things came from. And, you know, that's completely ridiculous today to think that way. And also to understand McCarthyism in our country, you know, that accused a lot of Jews of being communists falsely. But anyway, so I totally agree with you on prevention, and we need to develop prevention programs. And I hope, Jeff, that Beyond Barriers will do some of that. And I hope Change will too. And I feel really guilty that I realized I didn't introduce either of you properly, but all the bios are in the promotional materials, and they'll also be on the website for the event. So TM, do you have any closing comments? And Molly, and then I think we should close.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff, for your words. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Anne, for the great report. It's really important. What we also learned from the report is really that all these people there was fears and a fear of loss. And this is always, you're afraid of losing something. You're afraid of something that's going to change. It's been taken away. And the big problem is that in general society, very often those fears are not taken seriously. It's not true. It's whatever. And then you have these radical groups, and you probably have seen the same studies with ISIS and the jihadists, that they are coming say, no, I take your fears for real. I know this happening. And then you're like, oh, finally somebody is with me. And then it becomes like, yeah, we're your family. And the other ones you see, they're not your family. They don't even believe you that you're afraid of something. It's like it's compared to the child who's afraid of the monster under the bed, right? If you are a parent, well, you know that monster is not real, right? But you know the fear is there. It's not substantial, but it's real. The fear is real. It's like the child's personal truth, not the objective truth. This is what we have to realize when we talk to people. And that's not only white supremacists, because it's happening in all sorts of political hatred too, no matter if you stand on the left or the right. The other side always has fears. It's a fear of loss of something, and that you have to defend. And then you have a problem that people are not talking to each other. They're talking past each other. And like Daryl Davis says, a good friend of ours who's also a preventionist, we have lost the art of civil discourse. We have to walk across the cafeteria and talk and find out the commonalities. And then you actually let down these barriers, or look over. That was beautiful before with the Klan rally. Look over your barrier and see the other person, maybe just see a human being for a moment that you just hated before, and all of a sudden it's a human being you see. It's like scratching the paint of the bubble that painted on. It's a black person. All of a sudden you see, No, that's a person who's trying to help. And this helps lowering the guards of everybody, and that helps in our work. So this is where we have to go: prevention, work out civics classes, learn or relearn the art of civil discourse. Very important. Thank you.
You're welcome. How about you, Molly? Any closing comments?
No, I think we're already over, so I'll.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And if we didn't, if Zoom didn't function properly, I'm really sorry about that. But it will be posted on the website for anybody that you know that wish to come. And see you all next time. Bye-bye. Thank you, TM. Thank you, Jeff. And keep up the
Thank
great
you,
work.
Anne. Thank you, Molly.
You're welcome.
Thank you all.
You're
Bye.
welcome. Thank you for coming.
Bye.
What a
Thank
beautiful
you.
painting, too. Okay, bye, everyone.